Now it's time for our second panel to do this. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Lieutenant General Robert Ashley, former Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. Lieutenant General Ashley retired from the U.S. Army in November of 2020, and after over 36 years of active service as an intelligence officer, his last position assumed on October 3, 2007 was the 21st Director of DIA. Previously he served as the Army Deputy Chief of Staff, J2, advising the Secretary of the Army and the Army Chief of Staff on intelligence, counterintelligence, and security. He has commanded at the company, battalion, squadron, and brigade levels, completing 6 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan as a squadron and brigade commander and as Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, J2. So now I'll turn the discussion over to Lieutenant General Ashley to introduce our panelists and lead the discussion and Q&A session. And also, Lieutenant General Ashley is a commissioner on the Afghanistan War Commission.
An honor to be here, an honor to be part of this commission, and to everybody that has set this up, from NISA, from the Middle East Institute, from GNSI, University of Southern Florida, I'd like to really kind of say thanks to the students, right? So as I look out, broad demographic here in front of us, but really as you listen to the ambassadors, you listen to General McKenzie, other folks that have talked this morning, you will see this in your lifetime. This will be part of your lifetime going forward. And so I compliment you for taking interest in what's taking place in the world, and specifically for taking interest in what's happening in Afghanistan. The ambassador asked some very fundamental first-order questions that are really, really hard to answer. Those are tough questions. But the American people deserve an answer to those. And I think that's part of what we're looking at with the commission. But these things, and you heard cycles that kind of come and go, this will all be part of the fabric of our lives as we move forward. So I really want to thank the students that have been part of this. So the title was Countering Terrorism Dilemma. So what's a dilemma? Dilemma is a hard choice between multiple courses of action. And you've heard a lot of things discussed today, right? From the continuum of this is something that's key in our national security interests, to its waning, even to the comment that the existential challenge that it never was on terrorism. Something to discuss. So before I introduce the panel, I'd say today's objective for this panel is threefold. First, we want to lay the foundations for the CT strategy that we engaged upon after 9/11. Talk a little bit about how the intel community, how special operations, those forces came in, and the policy that underpinned that. The second part, where are we now? How do we characterize the nature of the threat that the Taliban is observing and engaged with now that we've been 2 years removed from Afghanistan? And as the ambassador alluded to in his previous comments, the third part of this is, what are the opportunities going forward? How do we mitigate the threat? And how do we do it from a distance? And what is the nature of that threat? And what are the opportunities in the great power competition that will or will not play out in Central Asia? So first, let me introduce the panel. So we're fortunate to have Dr. Hassan Abbas, who is a distinguished professor in international relations at NISA at the National Defense University. In the late 1990s, he served as the police chief in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And this is a province bordering Afghanistan. He's the author of The Return of the Taliban, Afghanistan After Americans Left, published by Yale University. Ambassador Ali Jalali is a distinguished professor at NISA for Strategic Studies in the National Defense University. He also served as an Interior Minister of Afghanistan and the Afghanistan Ambassador to Germany. Previously, he served with the Voice of America for over 20 years, covering Afghanistan, South and Central Asia, and the Middle East. His most recent publications include A Military History of Afghanistan, From the Great Game to the Global War on Terror. Colonel Retired Chris Molino, a career Army officer with combat deployments with the Army and Joint Special Operations in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Chris also served as senior staff assignments focused on CT and U.S. policy. And he's had multiple assignments in the Pentagon, working in legislative engagements for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Director of the African CT and the OSD Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict, as well as the Director of CT for the National Security Staff. And lastly, Ambassador Ahmed. Ambassador Ahmed is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, focusing on security, counterterrorism, trans-regional militancy, and illicit networks. From 20 to 21, he served as Afghanistan's ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. And previously, he was a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and currently teaching at George Washington University. So thank you, gentlemen, all for being part of the panel. So let me open with the scene setter. So we talked about, a lot of this, the genesis of this was the terrorist threat after 9/11. Al-Qaeda was not something that was new to the intelligence community or the U.S. We had been following bin Laden since the 90s, whether it was in Sudan, previous time into Afghanistan. And then the original mission to defeat Al-Qaeda when we went in after 9/11. So for us to understand what we're facing in the future, which is kind of alluded to by the ambassador, what does this over-the-horizon CT mission look like? I think we have to establish some context. So what did it look like as we went in from a policy standpoint, and how we built forces on the ground to deal with the terrorism fight that we faced? So I'm going to ask Colonel Molina to kind of get us kicked off, talk a little bit about from a policy standpoint, but what was the force structure that we put in place so that you have some context of the size of what we had on the ground, how we were able to deal with the terrorist threat, so that you understand that as we move into where we are now, as we move ahead, and what over the horizon looks like. So Chris.
Thanks for that. So it's difficult to get into this topic without getting drawn into the very tactical nature of military operations. So I will try to avoid doing that and stay operational and strategic. But it's worth considering the way the United States deployed forces, and then to appreciate the amount of change that likely occurs over 2 decades, right? The technological advances and whatnot. In 2001, when we deployed forces, we had very traditional means of intelligence gathering, conventional means of intelligence gathering, and a very traditional targeting structure within the U.S. military. The find, fix, finish, exploit, and analyze structure that existed for the military really didn't have much experience with the exploit and analyze. The find, as General Ashley mentioned, we've been tracking terrorists from the HVIs for years and years. You can do more of that in country with access, certainly. The fix aspect was improved with presence, and the finish is obviously there when you have tactical forces on the ground able to do that. We didn't have a ton of experience in the modern military with the exploit function and the analyze, and really the richness that provides into a targeting cycle to be able to do our mission as a nation or as a coalition more efficiently. So I think in the early years of the war, what you saw was a robust find, fix, finish force that really focused on HVIs and hunting high-valued individuals with conventional intelligence. And over time, over the first 4 or 5 years, that capability improved. So with General McChrystal, particularly some of the changes that he brought in that General McKenzie referenced earlier, we really moved to a network-centric approach in terms of targeting. Our find, fix, finish began to take on the exploit and analyze functions that I referenced, and we began targeting in a network-centric way. And we were looking at how to dismantle networks in order to get after those HVIs, rather than just cutting off the head of the hydra and expecting that would somehow solve the problem. We began to develop fusion centers. We tried with the Afghan Hands program, for example, to develop expertise, as previously mentioned today. That network-centric approach really lasted for, again, another 4 or 5 years. Well, as I referenced, the technological advances and now the presence of massive fleets of UAVs, dwell time, collection, analysis, dissemination came into our lexicon for find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, and disseminate. And that targeting cycle matured and improved. So with our increased and expanded ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and now increased data exploitation, our network-centric and our HVI targeting was then complemented by digital forensics, biometrics that existed down at the very tactical level. And we were able to have intelligence-driven operations. And it's something that General McChrystal harped on in many of his roles, but particularly within the Joint Special Operations Command. So we experienced several years of improved dissemination and improved targeting. We then moved into what I would consider our last phase, where we looked at really an advisory role. And the find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate function really turned into how to enable a partner force. What was ANSF led, we tried to transfer those functions to the Afghan forces to make sure that they could sustain and that they could continue this kind of targeting cycle. I'll pause there, just because I think that sets the scene that we wanted to establish before going into some of the other questions.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about policy in a second, but what I'd ask the other gentleman to comment on is your observations on the CT strategy specific as we went in to this phase of the war before we transition to start talking about what's the nature of the threat that we're seeing on the ground now. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're on.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very, on-the-spot description of what we started there. But for me, I was confused when I was Minister of Interior. I'm dealing with a crime scene or a battlefield. And in many cases that we had to deal with this terrorism and insurgency through police, through law enforcement, actually we, in fact, made it a war, made it a battlefield, which created more, actually, problems for us, more terrorists, more insurgents. I think I remember from my days in the Staff College, one thing that always we used to say is that you have to fight a war that you face, not a war you know. In many cases, some of our allies actually were fighting a war that you know, not a war that they faced. Therefore, the issue started at the tactical level and expanded to strategic level. At strategic level, we did not address many of the issues that actually fed the terrorism and insurgency. I think Ambassador McKinney very clearly said that in any insurgencies, if you do not deal with sanctuaries, you are not going to win that war. Thank you very much.
Other gentlemen, comments on the kickoff of the CT fight?
I'll very briefly add and fully support what Mr. Jalali has just mentioned. But my puzzle is, we knew this very well. The RAND Corporation report saying most of the insurgencies were defeated through law enforcement approach. Why, with a significant amount of investment from the word go, we never thought of building initially a criminal justice system and rule of law? Because that would have enabled the local civilian law enforcement to develop as a part of a structure which would have dealt with many of these issues. What went missing on our side, knowing fully well, because of our own experience as well, that puzzle to me still haunts me. Thank you.
Just very briefly, General, from my viewpoint, mainly because on the CT components, since there was largely a targeting piece, the public didn't have that kind of visibility as folks like yourself or Chris did. So we can't quite comment about, the merits of what worked or what didn't work, because, a lot of that information will control information. But from my viewpoint is that I didn't quite get, mainly because you had that kind of heart and mind campaign component as well. But from my point of view, I didn't quite get whether in Afghanistan over the years we were countering terrorism or we were containing it. Ambassador Jalali referred to the sanctuary part, and there were, other previous speakers who alluded to the sanctuaries part as well, is that, and General McKenzie mentioned how wars are either necessary wars or wars of choice, and since this was a necessary war and a just war, maybe because of the sanctuary issues, we were fighting it in a wrong country.
So, Chris, if I could come back and talk a little bit about how policy did or did not evolve over this time, because the other thing that we've all alluded to and everybody talked about is great comment on this being something of more of a legal issue if the framework was in place, but over time, we got a greater appreciation for that. Over time, it was more of an Afghan lead as those forces matured, and we got our own bearings because it was really an economy of scale effort up until probably around 7 or 8 as you're coming into the end of the surge into Iraq, because you've already heard the resources that were part of Iraq. It wasn't until the end of that surge, those resources in kind of the 2009 timeframe under General McChrystal's watch started to shift into Afghanistan. And so, Chris, is there anything worth kind of hitting on the evolution of the policy, or was it relatively stable throughout in terms of the way that was articulated from your view?
Yes, this is something we've talked about in advance of this, somewhat obviously, and I had a wonderful career in the military, 20 years that was spent mostly in the special operations world, but it was punctuated with various policy assignments, whether it was doing congressional fellow or congressional liaison work, or policy work in the special operations shop, or time on the National Security Council staff in the counterterrorism world. And so it's important to consider the way we articulate decision points to those decision makers, to our senior leaders in government. We see a lot of opinion pieces and we hear a lot about judgment on the decisions that were made. And in effect, what answers we were judging the answers that we arrived at to various problems. I think, and I'm hopeful just from what I've seen with our commission and the way we've organized our research, that we're also going to ask questions and we're also going to judge the questions that were asked of senior decision makers. So it's not just at what answer did they arrive, but what question did we ask them to answer? When you sit a bunch of principals in a room, or when you convene the National Security Council with the president at the head of the table, you have very discrete questions that you're asking for a decision on. Secretary Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, right as he was leaving, pulled in all the action officers in OSD policy and apologized for giving 2-hour suspenses. He became famous for saying, I want this question answered, you have 2 hours. The bureaucracy of the Pentagon, if anyone's ever experienced it, it seems absolutely impossible to work through this. But Gates explained that the reason he did that is because he didn't want the gears of bureaucracy to grind the teeth off of the experts' arguments. And so he wanted to hear from the action officer. It's very rare that you get an action officer in the secretary's office. There's too many undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries. And as a side note, I think the longer your title in the Pentagon, maybe the less important you are, right? So Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, I'm kidding, Colin. But in all seriousness, what a wonderful reflection of an awareness of the bureaucracy and looking to ensure that the proper question is being asked of the decision maker. And I think that's the real challenge when looking at something that's gone on for so long. The goalpost moved so many times. How we define victory changed over and over again. Were we fighting a counterterrorism war, or were we fighting against the Taliban, who still to this day are not declared as a terrorist organization? Right, so absolutely our security presence confused probably the local populace, and we probably made enemies. in our application of strategic decision making down at the tactical level. And so I think it's worth looking at any administration, and it's a particularly appropriate time now. How do we organize and how do we articulate the organization and function of the National Security Council staff? Who is a seated member? What is the meeting structure? Who's chairing those meetings? And how are we arriving at not only the answers, but how are we arriving at the questions that we're asking principals to decide on?
So before we move into the next phase of this, which is kind of characterize the nature of the threat, I thought Ian's quote from Milton was great, so I figured I'd throw out a good quote, and Chris kind of led me into that one. It's from Albert Einstein, and he said, "If I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes saving the world." And so look at how foundational that is to understanding the nature of the problem that you have to solve. So it was pretty clear that the nature of the problem that we had to solve was a threat from al-Qaeda, no longer emanating out of Afghanistan. So now we're 2 years removed. General McKenzie mentioned it. We've heard others talk about the nature of the threat and the time frame from which that would be a risk as not an existential threat, but an external operation either into Europe or into the United States. And so the intelligence community looked and said, you're probably going to see ISIS capable of an external operation somewhere in a 6 to 12 month window after we depart. 6 to 12 months. Okay, now we're at 24 months since the time we've departed. So what I'd like to do now, and we'll start with Dr. Hassan, is talk a little bit about the nature of the threat to help us understand the text and characterize it. We talked about the Deobandi. If you can help us understand that a little bit better and some of the trends you're seeing, and then we'll have some of the other panel members kind of weigh in on your insights, because we know you have networks, you have access, and you see things that are taking place by virtue of your extended Afghan network to what's evolving in Afghanistan today.
Thank you very much, General. I would begin by provocatively making a case that the nature of the threat in Afghanistan was and is linked to a variety of religious experience. And let me first say up front, I can prove, and this is widely known among the scholars of Islam and the region, that Afghanistan was historically a hub of the mystics. It was a hub of those religious leaders and scholars like Jalaluddin Rumi to so many others who had brought a very peaceful, very mystical dimension of Islam, not only to Afghanistan, but broader South Asia and Southwest Asia. Having said that, in that context, it was so important that Deobandism, which is, for the sake of ease, I would say this is a Sunni Hanafi social movement which had political motives linked to 19th century madrasa, a seminary in India, today's India. This was anti-colonial, this had very rigid views, social codes about gender and justice, but this was a new implant in so many ways to Afghanistan's religious spectrum. And this is very important because Hibatullah, who claims to be the Amir al-Mu'mineen or the great Islamic leader at this time of Afghans based in Kandahar, he proclaims to be or claims to be Sheikh al-Hadith, which means a scholar of Islam. Why it is different is that the founder of Taliban, Mullah Omar, at best was a warrior inspired by some of his religious dogma. Mullah Mansoor Akhtar, the second leader of Taliban, was through and through a gangster or a criminal through and through. Hibatullah, the current leader, ran a madrasa in Pakistan's Quetta, close to that, for a long time. Today, Hibatullah is building his constituency linked to two things. One, with rural imams from south and east of Afghanistan. And secondly, he's trying to build a new madrasa network. You will be surprised. There were very, very few modern seminaries in Afghanistan, even when Taliban were there. Most of the seminaries were operating in Pakistan from where these warriors were coming in. So the point I'm making is, it is the dogmatic version and variety of religious experience in Afghanistan believed by the Taliban, those Taliban who are in Kandahar, which I think is extremely important to understand. It's a mix of extreme tribal norms as well as extreme religious worldview. things of Deobandism, just one more thing on Deobandism, it has changed in India, for example. The Indian Deobandism is different. Even the Pakistani Deobandism in Karachi is different, but closer to the Afghanistan border, it is more militant, it is more reactionary, it is more rigid. And that is a major challenge. I'll not say that those in Kabul or even many of the cabinet members of Taliban belong to that worldview. They are different in some ways. And that's where the opportunity is. That's the trend I'm seeing. The religious discourse and divisions or debate will define which way Taliban ultimately go.
So, Ambassador Ahmad, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing with relationship to the Taliban and their relationship with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, and the tricky Taliban in Pakistan in terms of the nature of how they're managing that threat? Are they managing the threat? And is it on a growth path or relatively static? Because we talked about ISIS-K being able to attack within a 6 to 12-month window, yet, and then General McKenzie made references, Al-Qaeda was, for the most part, a non-organization. As we left, it was in the hundreds. But how do you characterize the threat and what the Taliban's doing to address it? Because that ties right back into the Doha agreements.
So that was it.
Yeah.
That was a question for myself. Okay.
I'll come back to you. Ambassador.
Yeah, so that was for me, yeah. Well, I mean, the Taliban has had this very interesting role in, perhaps as an overlord in the region's kind of sprawling militant network. It's not just, limited to Afghanistan, but it's in South and Central Asia right now. And they've maintained these multi-layered relationships, not just with groups like Al-Qaeda or the Pakistani TTP, but also transactionally with groups like ISIS Khorasan. So, and perhaps with ISIS-K, which, the Taliban call Khawarij or foreigners, I think the Taliban appears largely unconcerned about any groups that's destabilizing its regime, be it Al-Qaeda or the TTP. But getting here, has obviously required a great deal of political management on the part of the Taliban. Maybe some kind of a militant politics or Taliban, a way of diplomacy to ensure that that all of these groups are under their control and remain under their control. Now, I'll start with Al-Qaeda. With Al-Qaeda, since 1994, the Taliban had a twofold contract. One, an ideological contract that they signed in maybe around late fall of 1994 with Mullah Omar, then Taliban's leader, and this was an ideological contract. That contract, or the compact, remains unbroken. The second one was with the Haqqanis network. Now, Haqqanis are one of the governing factions of the Taliban's ruling regime right now, and that was an operational contract. Now, if you look at it, the Haqqanis' relationship with Al-Qaeda, in fact, predates the Afghan Taliban's relationships with Al-Qaeda, and so Chris mentioned that Taliban are not designated as a terrorist organization, but Haqqani networks are designated as a terrorist organization. Their leaders is a specially designated global terrorist by the Department of State. So it's very interesting to kind of see that. Now, after al-Zawahiri strike, there were real risk of Al-Qaeda, severing its tie with the Taliban regime, be it with the Haqqanis or with the Kandahari Taliban, because it was a big loss for Al-Qaeda. It was also a big embarrassment for the Taliban because all of these things happened on their turf, with some collusion or not. But for some reason, the Taliban clerics, the Taliban hardliners, they mitigated, any Al-Qaeda overreaction to al-Zawahiri's killing, and perhaps they made very important decisions. It's my understanding that, some of those concessions to kind of reset that relationship involved deepening its own kind of intelligence cooperation between, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, or elements within Al-Qaeda. Different operational arrangements with Al-Qaeda. They quietly conducted some internal retaliatory strikes and killings to, avenge Zawahiri. They took hostages, including reportedly an Afghan-American hostage. They rearranged Al-Qaeda camps within the region. They also tied on their key personnel for operational security, but also for information security. But locally, Al-Qaeda's presence is pretty public. If you go to places like Eastern Afghanistan, you go to Kunar province, you go to Nuristan, people will identify certain districts in those provinces. Oh, that's a TTP district, because they see TTP folks there. Oh, that's Al-Qaeda district. Oh, that's ISIS-K district. And it's pretty troubling, and those trends have been pretty troubling. But what the Taliban are also doing is they're registering AQ and foreign fighters. They're issuing them weapon permits, their travel documents. There's also a strong business side of the relationship as well, including in human trafficking, in drug trafficking, and weapons transfer. In some places, including in northern Afghanistan, there are Al-Qaeda units that disguise themselves as local businessmen. So that relationship has been pretty strong. Now, from my viewpoint, Al-Qaeda, for now, wants two things in Afghanistan. They want space for leadership refugee sanctuaries, and then they also want an operational space. Maybe they will get one. Perhaps this is maybe not the operational space for them to plan and plot external operations, but definitely some kind of sanctuary for their legacy leaders. But that legacy leader also have now a recourse in places like Iran, which is quite interesting. With TTP, it's quite different because for the Taliban, the TTP is Pakistan's internal problem. It's Pakistan's political problem. It's Pakistan's management or mismanagement problem, and that's how they operate. But there are in fact ideological siblings. There is a presence of TTP in Afghanistan, but to what extent, it's largely unknown. I think because it's a mismanagement problem on the part of the Pakistanis establishment, the Taliban believe to a large extent that they could play a peacemaker between the two, and they did, with the Haqqani governing faction taking the lead. But I'm not sure if the Pakistani establishment engage in good faith negotiations, largely because they started those negotiations inside Afghanistan, and then kind of lured senior TTP leaders into the forefront only to target them later. So even if those conversations go on after this, I think it would be really hard kind of engage in those sincere good faith negotiations. The way the Taliban is managing the TTP is that they've given them those sanctuaries, but they've also told them not to be a headache for them. Going forward, I think it would be interesting to see whether the TTP, acquires some kind of a territory inside Pakistan. If they have a territory again, and it traces back to some kind of a support network within Afghanistan, I think it's going to create a big problem for the Afghan Taliban.
Okay, so for Ambassador Jalali, as you look at what's happening in the madrasas, what's developing now in Afghanistan, do you see a greater risk of a broader fundamentalist movement that could be a threat extending beyond Afghanistan as we're moving ahead, because we have less visibility in what's taking place, and then clearly with the Taliban back in power?
Thank you. Yes. It all depends, it relates to the nature of the Taliban system, Taliban government. They do not have a support from inside the country. They have no international recognition. And therefore, they are trying to expand their base. Their base will help them for recruitment, future recruitment, at the same time to support base. They have decided that this can be done only through the expansion of madrasas. The madrasas that actually teach Talibanism mostly. Recently, the Taliban government officials announced that they have the number of madrasas that have opened and established now about 21,000. And they also announced that about 350,000 students are going to these madrasas. Now, they are separate from the jihadi madrasas. They said that in each district, they will open about 10 jihadi madrasas. Jihadi madrasas are the kind of madrasas that they are preaching or preparing the students for jihadi operations. Now, if you look at the districts in Afghanistan, about 500 or more, there are at least 5,000 jihadi madrasas in Afghanistan, if they are real. Even if these numbers are not real, the idea is actually establishing a kind of a potential for future radicalism. Those students who are coming from a young age go to these madrasas. In many cases, even during the Afghanistan jihad, many of these students who were poor students, they could not afford to go to school, they have boarding schools in these madrasas. They will send them to these madrasas. These Talibans are one product of those madrasas. Now, this is a potential for the radicalism. On the other hand, the followers of Taliban are beholden by their commanders, their leaders. It is not a centralized, despite the fact that the idea is there, the ideology is there. So then, this potential at the same time can be detrimental to the authority of the leader. Now we are talking about the new Taliban. They are not the Taliban of the past. The Taliban I covered in 1990s, the Taliban I dealt with them, insurgents in the 2003, and the Taliban I see today, they are different. The Taliban of 1990s were actually mostly a product of a public reaction to prevailing chaos. You know what happened after Mujahideen took over? They divided the country into fiefdoms, and then their commanders, their followers, their cronies actually dominated the streets and highways for extortion, for lawlessness. And Taliban, regardless of what happened later on, who used them, who actually adopted them, who embraced them, who supported them, regardless of this. But at the beginning, they were supported by the Afghanistan people because they thought that they are bringing some sense of order and then disarm the militias and unify the country. As long as they stuck to these purposes, they were supported. That's why in 4 years they actually dominated 90% of Afghanistan. But then 3 other issues actually changed that identity of Taliban. First, they discriminated against certain ethnic groups, and they, at the same time, they started interpreting Islam the way that Afghans were not familiar with it. And third, they brought foreigners and Al-Qaeda and terrorists. That actually was the trend. That was the Taliban of 1990s. Taliban of the later on, when they were fighting insurgency, they were at a prototype insurgency with a basis in Pakistan, in Iran sometimes, and at the same time support from different countries, fighting with the legitimate government of Afghanistan, which was supported by 3 other countries. That was a different Taliban at the time, and their motto was to fight foreign invasion and re-establish the Islam in Afghanistan. Today, Taliban are different. 4 reasons should be noted for the power of the supreme leader, which is sitting in Kandahar and actually calls the shots. First, as Dr. Abbas said, he's a well-educated faqih or Muslim scholar. Second, he has jihadi credential because he sent his son for as a suicidal bomber against the what they call it, the occupiers. The third, he belongs to a large Pashtun tribes, Nurzai tribes. While the founder of Taliban, Mullah Omar, belonged to Hotak tribe. It's a very small tribe. And at the same time, he was an ordinary mullah of a village. Then his successor, as Dr. Abbas also mentioned, Mansour was a businessman, or whatever you call him. No other credentials. But he has the most, prominent credential he claims is he was the leader of the Taliban that led them to military victory there. And then he is a kind of a hardliner. Around them are hardliners. The people who are around them are hardliners. So he actually transformed the power to extreme authority. In an Imarat Islami, you say, Amir has the legitimacy from God. All should follow him. That's why he is the strongest person now in the Taliban, not the Taliban of the past. Regardless of these other people who have some kind of constituencies like Haqqani and others, but they are now not in a position to challenge him. And recently, he actually took the authority of the Ministry of Defense and Interior to have access to weapons, access to arsenals. So he has it. Now, with that kind of authority, with that kind of power, and that kind of power is unchallenged in Afghanistan. In that unchallenged, he will try to continue this madrasa system, radicalism, and at the same time, he will put his own people everywhere in this. And mostly from the Kandahar area. I think today I saw that 28 members of the cabinets are from Kandahar. There is a mistake. Some people make that Ghilzai in Durrani. It's not Ghilzai Durrani. Durrani is there, and Haqqani is not Ghilzai nor Durrani. It's a Karlani. It's another. So it is very complicated, complex. You have to look at these things. Now, yes, as you said, this approach could create a potential for long term. Today, if they strike a balance between their jihadist ambitions or obligation to support their jihadi brethren on the one hand, and at the same time to restrain their activities for geopolitical purposes, but this potential is there. It is not going to disappear easily, particularly when they are not challenged internally or externally. Thank you.
So I'm going to come back to that later on, because Ambassador McKinley made the comment that there was some splits starting to form. So I want to come back to that in our last question, which is really about opportunities. But let me allow the other panel members on what Ambassador Jalali just talked about, and then as you kind of characterize that. You can see how this metastasizes in Afghanistan internal as a challenge for just the way of life and what we heard from the previous panel. If you think about, because we're focused on the CT or the CT piece of this and the terrorist threat, is what he just described, moving from 1.0 to 2.0, a greater an external threat for the U.S. and other nations, or do you see this as something that really is just contained inside the borders? And can it be contained? And I'll open this up to anyone else who wants to take that one.
If I briefly add, I think currently it is contained in a sense that it is contained regionally. However, there's a huge potential for its expansion. Two reasons for that. One, I was interviewing somebody who really hosted Sirajuddin Haqqani in UAE and Saudi Arabia. And that explains our CT puzzle. Hibatullah is an extreme cleric with expanding support base, who we are left with to talk to, mostly cabinet members who are on top of our FBI foreign terrorist list. But I personally believe there's no way Sirajuddin Haqqani could have been in UAE and Saudi Arabia without at least our approval, if not facilitation. And the purpose for that is because he is seen as pragmatic. Keeping aside, he has American blood on his hands, no doubt about it. He was somebody who was the architect of the suicide bombing campaign. So those are terrible things. Keep those on the side for a second. Still, the pragmatic, whether he or when Sirajuddin Haqqani and others in Kabul are they also equally militant and extremist in their religious worldview? We are not seeing those signs. They can be very lethal, they can be extremely problematic. At this moment, it is in their interest to contain the issue. I was asking this question to some friends who are dealing with this issue in Saudi Arabia and UAE, and they were also mentioning that their meetings or the meeting of the Qatari Prime Minister with Hibatullah, none of them came out positive that they can really engage in a religious discourse. The Pakistanis sent a huge delegation of Deobandi leaders from Karachi. The topmost Pakistani cleric went there to see Hibatullah, and Hibatullah snubbed him and humiliated him and told him, don't try to tell me whether girls want to should be going to school or not. This is none of your business. I am a bigger scholar than you are. However, when the same question is asked to many cabinet members in Kabul, they seem to be agreeing in principle with many of the things, some of the things at least, that we want. So that's the puzzle. Internally, there's a division. It can be expanding in so many ways. That offers some CT-related or counterterrorism opportunities for us.
Okay.
Just very briefly, because the Taliban Emir's role has become very prominent now. It did not used to be, because there are, multiple coalition partners, and it's a flimsy coalition, but somehow it sticks. But the Emir's role is important mainly because he's not just the Emir of the Taliban followers in an ideological sense, but he's now effectively the commander-in-chief in the military sense. And because historically the military power within the Taliban's governing factions were heavily concentrated in the Haqqani network, and the political power kind of more concentrated within the Quetta Shora Taliban, who now constitute the greater Kandahar Taliban. The Emir is trying to reverse that. And that's precisely as to why, he wants to have a control over weapons or weapons transfer, or weapons distribution, whether that's, relates to the Taliban Ministry of Defense or the Interior or their intelligence services, as, Ambassador Jalali mentioned. But the interesting thing is that the Emir has, because it's an ideological government, the Taliban cannot run any government that's not ideological, but the Emir's vision, or conservative vision of power, revolves fundamentally around three things. You have the Emir himself as a paragon of virtue. You have, the mosque as a place of endowment, as a place of inspiration. And then you also have the Taliban's religious bureaucracy and their, executive bureaucracy in Kabul who serve as the Emir's enforcers. Effectively. And so what the Emir has done very cleverly is that he has effectively married and wedded the Taliban's clerical and executive powers, even though, he's nowhere to be seen because he hasn't come out publicly. And that's very interesting because his approach is very textualist, very originalist. The way he, and his, friends, Mullah Omar, for example, at the time in September 1994 defined the Taliban's vision for Afghanistan, he has stuck to that, which was to take over the system and fundamentally remold it. And that's precisely what he's doing. Re-engineering the Afghan society, wholesale re-Islamization, because they believe, Afghanistan had a, Islam has been around for the last 1,450 years, but Afghans are not Muslim enough, so you have to kind of re-Islamize to make them, good Muslims. And also kind of re-engineering the Afghan society through his own version of Afghan nationalism, because he's channeling now the Islamic nationalism into that. And with that, he's positioning himself as the vanguard of true Islamic leadership, not just for Afghans, but for the Islamic Ummah, the Islamic followers. So it's very interesting, and that's why he believes that doing so, and by concentrating power within the religious clerics and his chief top lieutenants, it will create a bigger, or it would ensure predictability and the survivability of its regime. And in some ways, he has a point, but in other ways, he's. I think it's important that we not overinterpret his motivations, mainly because we're tracing it, but we need to listen more to understand it and not just respond to it.
Yeah. Chris.
My concern about the nature of the terrorism threat in Afghanistan right now is how much we truly understand it, or don't. You know, at the height of our F3EA, not to go back to that necessarily, but at the height of our understanding of intelligence on the ground with wonderful access and good partners, we made a prediction about a timeline for a threat to the homeland from ISIS-K, resident in Afghanistan. And you know, intelligence is often like fresh cut flowers. The further away you get from the cut, the more that the quality of that information withers and dies, right? So we're pretty far away from an understanding. And with our total withdrawal from Afghanistan, I would make the case that it was less a withdrawal and more an abandonment. And we missed the opportunity to simply deflate that presence and bring it down and maintain access in a region of the world where we predicted threats might take root. And we don't have to look too far in our history, it's ongoing, to find other examples of intelligence failures. And that's not a slight at the intel community. Again, it could go back to what questions are we asking of ourselves, and by what methodology are we measuring levels of threat. In our partnership programs, we tend to build two things: capacity and capability. We provide capacity as the United States and our coalition partners, and we improve capability. And we did a fair job of that in Afghanistan, certainly. And Ambassador McKinley referenced our overestimation of the Afghan forces' capability, or maybe the numbers, the ghost soldiers on paper. I often heard criticism about Afghan willingness to fight, and I disagree with this completely. I think the ANSF probably lost the will to fight when they questioned whether or not we would remain. And I think that you can look at other theaters of conflict and look at examples where we've gotten it wrong on estimations of will to fight. And I know the intelligence community has recently implemented a rubric by which they measure will to fight, and they have a way of accounting for these very subjective things and assigning a score and trying to make a judgment on will to fight. And so I think as we consider what a terrorist threat might look like coming from Afghanistan, it's important to ask that question of will to fight, both internally to counter it. But there's another element that doesn't often get talked about in this will to fight sort of bin of considerations, and that is the will to support. We've been surprised by the will of other countries to support various conflicts and various sides of conflicts. And again, we're seeing that play out in ongoing conflict today. And so I think just to throw a few more things into the mix of considerations as we get predictive with increasingly imperfect access and intelligence, it's important to look at the other actors and the other stakeholders and consider who might throw in, who might back a power, who might benefit from a terrorist attack against the United States, and begin to really appreciate that we don't fully understand the nature of the threat. And that, for me, is the most concerning part, both about how we left Afghanistan, but also what I would argue is the growing threat resident there.
So before I go into the last section, the question about opportunities moving forward, this makes me think of the context of deterrence. So deterrence theory is kind of rests on three legs. One is I can deny you benefit of a capability, I can impose cost, I can punish you, and the third part is you got to be unequivocal on that articulation of that message, right? So that's how you set deterrence. It would seem that the Taliban, to some degree, would be deterred from allowing them, this kind of a threat to manifest back into Afghanistan, where it would be able to launch externally, for fear that U.S. or NATO or Western forces, however you want to characterize that, would come back in to address whatever that threat is. And just a short answer on this one, and we'll go to the last one. But how would you characterize whether the Taliban are deterred in terms of the way they look at the internal threats that they have to deal with the advent that the U.S. or Western forces would come back in and introduce forces? And let me just kind of work our way down with Dr. Boss.
Excellent question, sir. I think they can be deterred, but they are mixed results. Going after Zawahiri was a smart move because now Sirajuddin Haqqani, others know they are no more in the mountains. We exactly know where is the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, and we have the details, and they know it very well. All the rumor and the jokes in Afghanistan today are about the drones. Many parties were disrupted because they thought drones are up there. So that deterrence, the idea, whether those are really capable or not, that idea of that deterrence of drones and targeted strike is there. It is having an impact. In comparison, a counter argument is, Pakistan is very worried because of the Pakistani Taliban, who in some ways are the extension of Afghan Taliban. Pakistanis have given them every threat, blackmailed them, disrupted their houses in Karachi and Peshawar, and told them, if you'll not hand over the top Taliban, Pakistani Taliban leaders, we'll strike you. They did 3 Air Force strikes happened. Taliban in Afghanistan never budged. So the Pakistani deterrence is quite effective right next to it. Not as technologically high as ours here, but that's not working, which tells us they are ready to compromise. They are not going after Pakistani Taliban because they are their backup plan. If again Taliban are hit in Kandahar and Kabul, where will they go? They'll again go to the mountains. Who will be in the mountains? The Pakistani tribesmen. Who are those Pakistani tribesmen? Those who also host the Pakistani Taliban, the Waziris, the Masouds, and some of the others. So it's an existential issue. When it comes to ISK and others, they can be deterred. They might be open to collaborate also.
Thank you. Ambassador Jalali.
Thank you. I agree. I think the best way to deter Taliban is for the countries who feel somehow a threat to speak with one voice. Now, I don't think there's a worst case scenario of the threat against Europe or against the United States. The threat is mostly directed toward regional countries, where some of the terrorist organizations, terrorist groups are based in the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. Of course, the ISIS is different, and also Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is also now in the kind of strategic silence. But the regional countries all deal with the Taliban to contain the threats from Afghanistan. I think the Secretary General made efforts 3 times so far to bring together the special envoys of these countries in Doha, if they can agree on a unified approach against the Taliban. As long as that approach is not there, unified approach there, Taliban can use it, and it is very hard to deter them. Now and the future. On the other hand, the Taliban today do not see threats from outside, because they have relationship with many countries. 14 countries have accepted their diplomats. China has accepted their ambassador, and Kazakhstan too. And so they even don't care that if they do not get international legitimacy or recognition now. Because if they agree to all the demands for the recognition, requirements for recognition, they will lose power, lose influence, and they are not ready to do that. So to the leverage of legitimacy, the leverage of sanctions didn't work. It is not going to deter them. The only deterrence, I think, is from within. If within there is a problem, the Taliban fear from not outside, but from within. And that is if something happens inside the Taliban. If these people who claim wrongly or rightly that they are moderates, if they actually finally revolt, that could be deterrence. And otherwise, as long as countries deal with Taliban in different ways on the basis of their interest, it is not going to budge them. They're going to change their positions. Thank you.
Chris.
Yeah, thinking about deterrence theory, I think largely our modern deterrence theory is based on nuclear deterrence theory, and that hasn't been modernized in a very long time. And so I have some concerns at looking at what is predicated on a bilateral sort of model, and I worry about it from a contemporary nuclear deterrence standpoint, but also in this case. And I share the opinion that I think the Taliban are only emboldened by the way we left, and their newfound air force and hardware, and I think one of the most dangerous things that we could do as a nation or an international community is give recognition to the Taliban, and then further embolden them in their current path.
Yeah, Ambassador.
Just very briefly, like 3 points. One, threat is a very powerful motivator. So if you threaten a regime like the Taliban, especially if their survivability depends on it, I think they will respond, pretty positively, and they have in the past. That's one. Second, on the external operations, Chris mentioned the capabilities part and the resources part, but if you have the intent, like Al Qaeda or ISIS-K, then to attack, you will find those capabilities, or you will develop it. And I think one of the principal things that I wanted to highlight was, the last 2 years or 3 years since the Taliban takeover provided some respite on the security side, of course, for ordinary Afghans, because the level of violence has considerably decreased. But it also provided this moment of reflection and kind of retreat and consultation for a variety of groups within Afghanistan and across South Central Asia to kind of sit down, reorganize, consult, think through, and maybe pool resources, and then think about their own future mission spaces. And in all of this, what's missing from the debate is that a variety of these groups, mainly because they've kind of now pooled their resources and their ideas, is that and have effectively formed these transactional overlapping partnerships and relationships. And these are oftentimes groups that were once competing forces with one another. But what's also missing from this debate is some conversation on scores of unaffiliated fighters, right? Unaffiliated fighters who have, effectively become the contractors or subcontractors for a variety of these groups. These are, people who travel to Afghanistan. They're, some way alumni of the Afghan War. They oftentimes also hold foreign passports. They travel with ease overseas. They're tech savvy. They use, encrypted apps for information security. They know people, and they could actually work with people in different groups, competing groups, ISIS-K and the Taliban. Basically groups that are arch enemies simultaneously, and that conversation is missing. So if we're talking about external operations, these are the people that's going to make it happen at some point. And one of the big things that they could actually do is leverage the diaspora communities for lone actors, lone wolf operations. Now, lone wolf, lone actor operations is not just a law enforcement issue anymore. It's a direct counterintelligence issue. Now, how are you going to deal with a counterintelligence issue? Of course, increase your intelligence collection. But you also need to work bilaterally with partners on the ground. Now, who is the partner on the ground? Nobody.
A huge challenge. So Jim asked me to buy us back a little bit of time. So we're going to do a quick wrap up here. I'd say about 60 seconds from each of you. The last question was, what are the opportunities, or who should we be teaming and partnering with going forward? Just a quick response, whether it's, the Taliban's have been considered as part of this, and other nations when we think about great power competition. But Ambassador Ahmed, I'll ask you to kick us off with a speed round here.
Sure. Maybe I'm like a minority voice here, but and let me kind of say this, that just because I'm saying this doesn't mean I enjoy saying this, but I think it's important that we recognize that sometimes we need to engage in offensive pragmatism. At times, we have to be kind of ruthlessly restrained. The Taliban is in unvarnished reality in Afghanistan right now. So, which is why I think we need to start looking, truth in the eye and kind of think about what's possible and what's practical. on the counterterrorism side, but also on non-counterterrorism side. And I think the first thing we need to do is that, or the first thing I would say is that the lazy explanation that I could give you is that if the Taliban is in power and they do not coexist with others, it's a problem. But if they're not in power and then, or if they're not in control and no one else is in control, that's a big, big problem, right? And so in this case, we need to kind of think a bit more in our own ways outside the box and unconventional, and maybe kind of exercise a degree of political courage since we're speaking about past, but also present. In hindsight, we're pretty clear. Going forward, I think we're trying to wait out the uncertainty, and I'm not sure if that's the way forward. Now, the main U.S. Taliban interest is to cooperate. To a larger degree, that cooperation is happening. Some over the table, some under the table, right? How do you formalize it, right? Maybe through or how do you kind of reach some kind of an informal understanding? You talk about legitimacy, recognition, normalization, sure. At some point that will happen, right? But we granted Taliban legitimacy the moment we sat down with them at the negotiating table in Doha. So those things have kind of lost its meaning, or at least kind of, the values of that is diminished. I would say three things. The first is, I think we should boost intelligence diplomacy. It could do wonders. We saw it with the Hamas stuff and the Palestine stuff. Second, open direct line of communication with the Kandahari Taliban, right? At least you get to know the inner workings of the Taliban. You understand or develop some kind of common language and interpret the way they interpret things and find some kind of common ground. And then the third is maybe at some point we will have to deploy some kind of a liaison service or liaison mission to the ground, whether that's a diplomatic support facility or other. And then maybe the fourth and the last point that I want to make is that I think the United States should approach the Afghan problem strictly from a value proposition aspect. And from value proposition aspect, meaning that who is more pragmatic among the Taliban and non-Taliban Afghans that I could work with, right? Sometimes that value proposition needs to be renegotiated, whether that's with the Taliban or with the non-Taliban Afghans. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Chris, 60 seconds.
I do think it's important to maintain the back channel and to enforce some of the previously established agreements, as we've talked about a bit during the morning session. I also think it's important to look at legitimate actors in the region who are also maybe larger stakeholders than we are and amplify their voices in our partnership.
All right, Chris, thanks. Ambassador.
There are many challenges and not many opportunities. But if the UN plan that proposed by Freydun Seneroglu finally actually gets acceptance by the major members of the Security Council, and the Secretary General is holding another meeting soon in Doha, if that actually gets through, that's one opportunity that can bring some kind of a normalcy. Thank you.
Thank you. Doctor.
Thank you so much, sir. 4 one-liners. One, I think we need to rethink or evaluate whether Taliban are playing good cop, bad cop with us when it comes to Kandahar, Kabul. It's possible. Secondly, to my first point on religious diplomacy, they are claiming to be holding a religious mantle. Let's engage on that path, because the roots of pluralism in Afghanistan are very strong, and we need to build on that, and we cannot give up on all those mystical dimensions and historical assets there. Third point, I think Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey are onto something. They are fighting over different deals and contracts. Maybe forget about other countries in the region. If these 3 countries come together and go to Kabul and give them a clear ultimatum on some of the city points or others, I think they would listen. And last but not the least, think about what Chinese are doing. They're doing something right. What is the Chinese model? Thank you.
Thanks. So let me close briefly where I started. To the students of the university, thanks for being part of this. These are things that you will face in your professional careers, and I hope you stay engaged in national security issues. But please join me in thanking the panel.